Paris, in the latter half of the 17th century, a century drenched in candlelight, gilded mirrors, and whispered prayers. It was the age when France dreamed itself eternal, when one man's will, Louis XIV, shaped not only a kingdom, but the very rhythm of the sun. And in that shimmering constellation of courtiers and poets, there shone a woman of wit, laughter, and unyielding flame, Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan. History tells us she rose to the very summit of royal favor, only to fall, consumed by rumor and jealousy. But what if she had not fallen? What if the king's heart had remained steadfast, her grace unbroken, and her laughter echoing still within the halls of Versailles? Good evening, my dear listeners. Welcome to Mythic Lives Altered. Wherever you are, perhaps listening by the window as dusk gathers, or walking a quiet path beneath autumn trees, I invite you to travel with me through time. Tell me where you are listening from, and remember to subscribe, so that together we may continue exploring the soft, flickering light of history's forgotten possibilities. Let us begin. The year is 1640, and the world into which Athénaïs is born is one of both grandeur and restraint. Her family, the Rochechouart, trace their bloodline to Charlemagne himself, nobles of impeccable ancestry but dwindling fortune. The chateau at Lussac-le-Château, though venerable, carries the melancholy air of faded pride. In the nursery, the air smells faintly of old books, candle wax and lavender drying in bundles near the window. Her mother, Diane de Grandsaigne, is a woman of stern grace. Her father, Gabriel, a man of charm and gentility, who teaches his daughter to love poetry as one might love prayer. From her earliest days, Athénaïs is restless. The convent to which she is later sent polishes her manners but cannot contain her spirit. The nuns call her the laughing child, for even punishment cannot silence her quick tongue or her secret delight in the absurd. At night, while the others sleep, she whispers to herself verses of Corneille and dreams of courts and chandeliers, of being seen, not merely observed, of commanding the gaze rather than receiving it. In those early years, she develops what the chroniclers would later call esprit, but which might better be called an intuitive brilliance, the gift of making others feel illuminated in her presence. She learns to observe not only words but gestures, tones, pauses. A sigh, she once writes to a friend, is sometimes the purest sentence a heart can speak. Even as a child, she understands the subtle language of admiration and desire, though she wields it not with vanity, but curiosity. France at that time is a kingdom still haunted by the shadows of civil war. The Fronde has left scars upon the nobility. The peasants labor under the weight of rebuilding, and the young Louis XIV, not yet fully king, grows up in an atmosphere of vigilance and pride. The stage is being set for a reign that will seek order, brilliance, and absolute control. A reign in which every gesture, every smile, and every whisper at court will matter. In this alternate world, dear listener, the young Athénaïs feels a subtle pull of destiny, a whisper that the world she dreams of will someday need her laughter to keep it from turning to stone. She is not the type to fade into obedience. Instead, she gathers the weapons of a woman in her age: wit, beauty, grace, and patience. Her education at the convent gives her polish. Her blood gives her confidence. But it is her heart, wild, compassionate, unashamed, that makes her unforgettable. Imagine for a moment the scene: a young woman stepping out from the cloister's gates into the wider world, her eyes wide not with fear but anticipation. Behind her lies the hush of discipline, before her the hum of Paris, the murmur of politics, the scent of opportunity. The streets of the capital are alive with gossip of ministers, lovers, and the young king's tastes. Somewhere, hidden among these murmurs, her name will soon be spoken. But not yet, for now she learns the delicate art of conversation, that most precious coin of 17th century France. At her cousin's gatherings in Poitiers, she encounters philosophers and poets, soldiers returning from campaigns in Spain, and ladies who measure each other's worth by the brilliance of their remarks. Athénaïs listens more than she speaks, but when she does, her words fall like light rain upon a summer's garden, refreshing, surprising, and impossible to ignore. Her laughter becomes her signature. It disarms envy, dissolves tension, and, in its purest form, hints at something transcendent, the refusal to let the world's cruelty dictate the soul's tone. Even in her youth, there is already that paradox that would later enchant Louis himself. She is at once proud and tender, sharp and forgiving. And so, as the years unfold, her path winds gently toward Paris, toward the heart of ambition. The narrator's voice lowers. Destiny is rarely loud in its beginnings. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to smile at a stranger, the way one lingers a moment longer in a doorway, or the courage to laugh when others bow their heads. If we listen closely, we can almost hear it. The faint echo of footsteps across the marble corridors of fate, the soft brush of a silken skirt against time itself. The door to the royal court stands open, and the young marquise-to-be walks toward it, not knowing yet how far her light will shine, nor how dangerous it will be. In the real world, this is where history would begin to draw its tragic arc. But here, in our imagined France, the France of second chances, the same laughter that once drew suspicion will instead become her shield. And thus, the child of laughter and fire takes her first step toward the Sun King. Paris, 1660. The air hums with restoration and ambition. France has recovered from its storms, and the court of Louis XIV blooms like a rose newly opened after rain, radiant, ordered, and perilous. Into this world of fragrance and ceremony steps Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, now the young Marquise de Montespan, wife to the Marquis Louis-Henri de Pardaillan de Gondrin. She arrives not as an ingénue, but as a woman formed, sculpted by wit, sharpened by longing, and clothed in confidence that seems to shimmer as surely as her jewels. Her laughter still carries that echo of childhood freedom, but now it is tempered by experience, by the understanding that the court is a chessboard, where every gesture is strategy and every smile a move. The court at Saint-Germain-en-Laye and later at Versailles is not merely a residence. It is a living theater of obedience, where the king is both sovereign and stage director. To enter it is to surrender one's privacy, to become part of a ritual of splendor that serves a single purpose, to mirror the king's power in every bow, every fan's flutter, every note of music. Athénaïs grasps this instinctively. She sees what many others miss, that the performance itself is the true art of survival. And yet she does not play her role mechanically. She plays it with style, as though she were born to turn ritual into grace. She first catches Louis's attention not through beauty alone, though beauty she has in abundance. It is her conversation that ensnares him, that rare blend of irony, intelligence, and sincerity. At a time when most courtiers offer the king either praise or fear, Athénaïs offers something rarer, curiosity. She dares to question, to tease gently, to reveal that behind her powdered exterior beats a mind alive with thought. One evening, when the king laments the burdens of rule, she replies softly, "Then let majesty learn the art of delight, for delight is also a form of power." Louis looks at her, startled, then amused, and from that moment the game begins. For weeks their encounters are brief, a word exchanged at a ball, a glance during a play, a shared smile amid the stiff machinery of etiquette. But these small sparks accumulate, forming a slow burning flame. The court begins to murmur. Some call her dangerous, others divine. The Queen, Maria Theresa, looks upon her with weary resignation. She has known since the beginning that her husband's heart is restless, seeking warmth where duty cannot give it. And yet, even she cannot wholly dislike Athénaïs. There is in the young marquise a genuine kindness, a respect that softens rivalry into melancholy acceptance. In this alternate history, the air around them vibrates with a quieter kind of transformation. The gossip that, in our real world, would soon destroy her, here becomes merely background noise, the usual envy of those who lack her charm. For Athenaeus moves carefully, aware of the delicate balance between affection and ambition. She refuses to humiliate the queen, treats her with deference, and cultivates alliances not only with courtiers, but with thinkers, artists, and priests. She understands that to endure, she must be more than a lover. She must become indispensable to the king's mind as well as his heart. Louis himself is changing. The Sun King has not yet fully ascended, and his temperament still oscillates between the ardent and the austere. He finds in Athenaeus a companion who steadies him, who mirrors not only his strength but his doubts. Her laughter dissolves his pride. Her frankness draws out the man beneath the crown. When she listens to him speak of architecture, she listens with genuine wonder, imagining gardens and palaces not as monuments to power, but as expressions of harmony. It is she who first speaks of Versailles not merely as a fortress of majesty, but as a living embodiment of order and beauty. The courtiers, of course, sense the shift. Their loyalties realign, their smiles tilt toward the rising sun of her influence. But Athenaeus, wiser than most, tempers triumph with restraint. She knows that favor too easily flaunted turns quickly to ruin, and so she cultivates modesty, or rather the appearance of it. Her dresses, though exquisite, avoid vulgar excess. Her jewels, though magnificent, are chosen for symbolism rather than weight. Gold, she tells her confidant, is a servant, not a master. Let it speak softly. As months turn into years, her relationship with Louis deepens into something more profound than flirtation. In her apartments, behind gilded doors, they speak not only of love, but of France, of the future, of how a kingdom might be ruled by light rather than fear. It is here, in this quiet intimacy, that the alternate world begins to diverge most clearly from our own. For in this version of history, the king listens. Her counsel does not threaten him, it steadies him. She becomes his confidant, not his scandal. In the evenings, the court gathers for spectacles of music and theater. Molière's comedies draw laughter. Lully's notes fill the air with motion. The king sits beside her, his gaze softened. Their presence together radiates a harmony that makes courtiers feel part of something larger, an age of beauty and balance rather than jealousy and suspicion. The narrator pauses here, letting the image linger, candlelight flickering on mirrors, silk rustling, the hum of violins blending with laughter. In that moment, Versailles is not yet the cold emblem of tyranny it would become, but a living poem, breathing with hope. The transition from guest to center of gravity happens gradually. Her apartments become a refuge for artists, scholars, and musicians. Conversations drift from theology to science, from love to geometry. Even Louis, who once prided himself on omniscience, listens humbly when she speaks. "Your Majesty," she says one night, "a throne is strongest when it is not afraid of questions." He smiles at that, and perhaps deep down begins to change. Yet there are always eyes watching. The court is a garden filled with serpents, and envy moves silently among the flowers. But in this imagined tale, Athenaeus senses danger early and disarms it not through cruelty, but grace. She protects the weak, pardons the foolish, rewards the loyal. Even her enemies find themselves uncertain. How can one hate a woman who so easily forgives? The court begins to resemble her temperament, elegant, intelligent, and faintly amused by its own absurdity. And so, the Marquise de Montespan rises not as the mistress of scandal, but as the architect of influence. Her laughter becomes legend, her counsel the king's quiet strength. Versailles, still in its infancy, grows beneath her guidance, not as a prison of etiquette, but as a stage upon which the art of being human is performed with dignity. Outside, the wind carries whispers of admiration, envy, and prophecy. Paris speaks her name as though it were a charm, and within the royal heart, love deepens into something enduring. For now, all is light. The candles burn high, the music swells, and the future opens like a golden fan in her hand. But history, even imagined history, is never content to rest. Behind the brilliance, shadows stir. For power, however benevolent, always calls forth its test. And as the dawn rises over Versailles, one can almost hear it, the faint tremor of destiny preparing to knock again. By the spring of 1667, Versailles has begun to bloom not only as a residence, but as an idea, a symbol of France's unbroken will and the king's divine confidence. The courtiers no longer question its endless corridors or gardens that seem to stretch into eternity. They accept it as the reflection of their monarch's soul, and within that reflection moves one figure who seems to give the light its color, Madame de Montespan. Her laughter ripples through salons, her perfume lingers like memory, and her presence binds the court in a spell neither born of fear nor lust, but of fascination. Louis XIV, once a ruler surrounded by flatterers, finds in her a mirror that shows him both his glory and his humanity. The relationship between them deepens beyond the usual rhythm of passion. What began as admiration ripens into partnership, the kind of bond that can shape not only hearts, but nations. In the early mornings, before the rituals of the day begin, they walk the unfinished gardens together. The scent of wet soil mingles with the sound of fountains, still under construction. Louis speaks of order and grandeur. Athénaïs speaks of proportion and harmony. A garden, she says softly, must never frighten the flower. Majesty should not crush beauty. It should invite it to grow. The king listens. Later, Le Nôtre will recall that it was after such walks that the gardens took on their softer geometry, the balance between structure and grace that would become the very emblem of French style. At court, her influence takes on visible form. Portraits begin to capture her not merely as a mistress, but as a muse of refinement, the embodiment of taste, intellect, and benevolent authority. Writers seek her approval. Composers dedicate works to her. Even foreign ambassadors note the civility she brings to royal gatherings. They write home that the French court, once rigid and dangerous, now possesses a new gentleness, a rhythm of moderation and wit. The king, always aware of appearances, understands that her presence stabilizes him in the eyes of Europe. She is not his scandal, but his serenity. And yet, influence at such heights is never without weight. In private, Athénaïs feels the quiet strain of being both woman and symbol. She knows that her laughter, once spontaneous, now carries expectation. Every word is measured, every gesture observed. But instead of hardening into vanity, she turns inward toward reflection. In this alternate world, rather than being consumed by the whispers that would one day destroy her, she uses them as reminders of humility. She writes letters to her children, ensuring they are raised in affection and learning rather than secrecy and shame. She arranges for her sister, Gabrielle, to act as their guardian at court, turning what might have been scandal into a model of discreet domestic grace. The king's illegitimate children grow not as shadows, but as living links between love and legitimacy, a quiet revolution in the ethics of monarchy. France itself begins to change in tone. The king's court, inspired by her composure, embraces reason alongside faith. She encourages Louis to patronize not only painters and playwrights, but philosophers and mathematicians. The Académie des Sciences receives his personal support, and the correspondence with thinkers across Europe grows. Some whisper that Madame de Montespan is the hidden architect of this intellectual flowering, the unseen hand guiding the Sun King's curiosity from the splendors of art toward the order of the mind. The narrator's voice slows, almost in reverence. This is the moment where history diverges most beautifully from the path we know. In our true world, the affair between king and mistress would grow heavy with gossip, poisoned by envy and religious guilt. Here, in the world of what if, it becomes something purer, not because it is without passion, but because passion itself matures into purpose. Louis, so often accused of vanity, begins to think of legacy rather than applause. He becomes more patient, more reflective. Even his wars, though still waged for glory, are tempered by the memory of her voice reminding him of the cost of pride. "Victory," she once told him, as the drums of Flanders thundered, "is sweetest when it leaves no bitterness behind." At court, this union radiates a strange equilibrium. The queen, though still dignified in her sorrow, is treated with new tenderness. Athenaeus takes care that every gift she receives from the king is matched by one for the queen's chapel or charities. The ladies of the court notice. What might once have been a rivalry turns into a kind of uneasy sisterhood. Gossip fades, replaced by a cautious admiration. The courtiers learn that grace, when wielded with intelligence, can tame even envy. Beyond Versailles, the people begin to hear of the king's new temperance, his unexpected mildness in matters of punishment and taxation. Rumors travel faster than edicts, and soon the peasants speak of the kind star beside the sun, a phrase whispered by the poor to describe the woman who seems to soften royal wrath. It is said that petitions read in her salon reach the king's desk more quickly, that the condemned find clemency when her name is invoked. History does not record whether these stories are true, but they spread because the people need them to be. In their hearts, they believe that somewhere in that palace of mirrors, a woman remembers them. Evening falls often in golden quiet. The great rooms of Versailles glow with candlelight, their reflections multiplying into infinity. Musicians play in the background, courtiers murmur like the rustle of leaves. The king and Athenaeus sit together near the window, looking out at the moonlit fountains. For a while, they say nothing. The silence between them has grown comfortable. Not the silence of exhaustion, but of trust. He reaches for her hand and she lets him hold it, their shadows merging on the marble floor. The narrator's voice softens to a near whisper. Power, when bound to tenderness, becomes almost holy. And yet, even in this peaceful, alternate world, there remains the quiet question that history never stops asking. How long can light resist the pull of its own gravity? In the hearts of courtiers, ambition still smolders. Priests still mutter about sin. Philosophers still question divine order. The world outside Versailles still suffers, and no amount of music can fully drown the echo of hunger. Athenaeus senses this, though she cannot yet see where it will lead. For now, she believes that love, wisdom, and beauty can coexist, that the king's favor is strong enough to shelter her from the winds of fate. But time, ever impartial, continues its slow turning. The fountains rise higher, the mirrors grow brighter, and beneath them all, unseen cracks begin to form. Small, delicate fissures that only later will show their strength. The narrator pauses once more, letting the sound of distant bells blend into silence. History, after all, is not built from events alone, but from the moments between them. The glances, the hesitations, the decisions made in candlelight that will one day shape the dawn. And as dawn approaches over Versailles, the king's heart, radiant and divided, beats in harmony with the rhythm of the woman beside him. Together they stand at the height of their glory, unaware that every ascent carries within it the whisper of descent. Yet for now, in the eyes of France and all of Europe, they are the embodiment of golden love. The sovereign and his muse, the sun and its reflection, their laughter mingling with the first light of morning. By 1670, Versailles stands not only as a symbol of royal might, but as the living pulse of a civilization intoxicated with its own elegance. The marble floors gleam like the surface of still water. The chandeliers sway gently in the night air. scattering light that dances across painted ceilings. In this world of controlled splendor, every movement is a declaration, every smile a mask. Yet within this glittering theater, Madame de Montespan has achieved what few before her dared even to imagine, not merely to exist in the king's favor, but to shape the very texture of his reign. Still, her triumph is not without shadows, and the deepest of them bears the name of Maria Theresa, Queen of France. The queen, devout and gentle, walks through her days like a figure carved from porcelain. She loves her husband with a quiet, unwavering faith, not out of passion but of duty, and perhaps a kind of holy resignation. In our true history, this devotion would have made her the tragic counterpoint to Montespan's fiery ambition. But here, in this altered thread of fate, Athénais takes another path. Instead of challenging the queen's sorrow, she seeks to comfort it. She remembers the cold gaze of convent corridors, the loneliness of perfection demanded but never rewarded. She sees in the queen not a rival, but a woman, bound by circumstance. Their reconciliation begins in silence. One evening, after Mass, Athénais approaches her with an offering, a donation for the queen's charities, written in her own hand. The queen hesitates, then accepts. For the first time, their eyes meet without hostility. It is a brief exchange, but it softens something within the court. Whispers of rivalry are replaced by murmurs of curiosity. The king, observing this new gentleness between the two women, feels a weight lift from his heart. It is as though the air of Versailles has cleared, the ceaseless tension dissolving into a fragile peace. From that moment, Athénais begins to weave a new kind of influence, one that no longer feeds upon exclusivity but upon harmony. She becomes the court's quiet mediator, using her charm not to divide but to unite. When disputes arise between nobles, she soothes them with humor. When artists quarrel over favor, she reminds them of their shared devotion to beauty. Even the clergy, who once muttered sermons against her vanity, find themselves disarmed by her piety. She sponsors convents, hospitals, and orphanages, not as public gestures of repentance, but as natural expressions of compassion. The courtiers cannot tell whether it is strategy or sincerity, and perhaps she herself no longer knows the difference. Louis, watching her transformation, feels his admiration deepen into reverence. He finds in her not the intoxicating mistress of youth, but a partner of wisdom. In this alternate timeline, the king's affection matures rather than fades. Their love grows quieter, more reflective. The court still dazzles with spectacles, but now, after the last candle has been snuffed and the dancers have gone, the two of them remain together in the hush of the royal chambers, speaking softly of mortality, of God, of the strange loneliness of power. "We are but shadows of what we command," she once murmurs, and Louis nods, for he too feels the truth of it. This evolution between them begins to shape the tone of governance itself. The king's decisions, once impulsive or fueled by pride, become tempered by reflection. He begins to seek balance in policy, to weigh justice against mercy. It is said that he prays longer in the mornings now, that he listens more carefully to his ministers, and speaks with more patience to ambassadors. And though none dare say it aloud, all know who has influenced this change. The queen, too, feels the shift. She does not rejoice. Her heart remains heavy. But she finds solace in the knowledge that the woman who once threatened her peace now shares her devotion to virtue, even if through different paths. There is an evening when all three, king, queen, and marquise, attend a small concert at the chapel. The voices of the choir rise in slow, ethereal harmony, and for a moment their gazes meet across the soft candlelight. No words pass between them, but something like forgiveness flickers in the air. It is a delicate, almost invisible understanding, a truce between love, duty, and grace. The courtiers later whisper that it was the most serene night Versailles had ever seen, though none could explain why. Beyond the palace, this harmony begins to echo throughout France. The salons of Paris speak admiringly of the king's moderation, of the court's new dignity. Diplomats abroad write that France's greatness now rests not merely on conquest, but on culture, on the gentleness of its ruling pair. For few know how deeply the marquise's influence has ripened into wisdom. The queen's charities expand, the king's decrees grow milder, the nobles, following the tone set from above, temper their pride with civility. It is as though the entire nation inhales a calmer air. Yet even peace carries its burden. The more Athénée cultivates grace, the more she feels the fragility of her position. She knows that time, which erodes all beauty, has begun its quiet work. The courtiers, ever restless, seek new faces to adore. Madame de Maintenon, her former friend and governess to her children, begins to rise. Not as a rival yet, but as a reminder that devotion can outlast charm. Athénée feels the tremor of mortality beneath her silks. Still, she does not despair. Instead, she resolves to deepen her purpose. She turns her energies to art, patronage, and education, believing that influence preserved through goodness is stronger than that won through desire. One evening, as she walks the gardens alone, the wind carries the scent of orange blossoms from the king's orangery. The fountains murmur softly, the moon drifts above the treetops. She pauses, looking back at the windows of Versailles, each one glowing like a star in the night. For the first time, she wonders whether power is not meant to be possessed, but simply passed through, a light borrowed for a time, to be handed onward. She whispers to the wind, "Perhaps grace is not in the keeping, but in the giving." The narrator lets the words linger, as if suspended in air. This is the turning point, the delicate fulcrum upon which the alternate history balances. For in this imagined France, Madame de Montespan does not fall from grace. She transcends it. By embracing the queen's shadow rather than fleeing from it, she turns rivalry into reconciliation, and her story, once destined for scandal, becomes a meditation on humility. As the night deepens and the palace grows still, the sound of distant music drifts through the corridors, faint and wistful. Somewhere a clock strikes midnight, its chime fading like a heartbeat into silence. And from that silence, another dawn prepares to rise, a dawn in which France will awaken to beauty touched by mercy, to power softened by compassion. By the mid-1670s, Versailles has become the living theater of civilization itself. Within its galleries and gilded halls, the spirit of France finds expression in color, sound, and movement. Painters blend heaven and earth upon their canvases. Poets write with a rhythm that seems to echo the fountains beyond the windows, and musicians weave harmonies that mirror the symmetry of the gardens. At the center of this flowering stands Madame de Montespan, no longer merely the king's beloved, but the unspoken heart of France's cultural awakening. The courtiers call her La Belle Athénaïs, yet to the artists, she is something gentler. Their protectress, their muse, the pulse of inspiration that gives the age its warmth. Each morning her apartments are filled with voices, composers presenting airs for her approval, painters unrolling sketches for new frescoes, playwrights reciting verses still damp with ink. Molière himself, ever the keen observer of human folly, finds in her both audience and collaborator. She understands his irony, laughs in the right places, and urges him towards subtlety rather than cruelty. Ridicule, she once tells him, should wound pride, not dignity. He takes her advice to heart, softening his satire into moral elegance, and dedicates to her one of his most refined comedies. Lully, too, feels her influence. Under her gaze, his music becomes less ceremonial, more lyrical, a language of emotion rather than power. In this alternate history, the arts at Versailles do not become the servants of majesty alone, but companions of intellect and grace. The king encourages this transformation. Though Louis remains proud and demanding, Athénaïs' counsel tempers his desire for grandeur with her instinct for proportion. "Let the soul of France," she tells him one evening as they stroll beneath the colonnade, "be known not by its walls but by its music." He smiles, and within weeks new funds are granted to musicians, sculptors, and scholars. The Académie Française expands its patronage. Writers from across Europe send manuscripts to Paris, hoping for her glance, her word of praise. Versailles, under her quiet direction, becomes a kind of sanctuary for creation, a place where beauty, intellect, and power converse without fear. The narrator's voice softens, carrying the listener into the golden calm of her influence. The palace is no longer just a symbol of royal dominance, but of the flowering of human imagination. Painters work by lamplight, their pigments gleaming like jewels upon the palettes. In one of the galleries, a young sculptor presents a marble figure of Diana, serene and strong. Athénaïs stands before it and sees perhaps a reflection of herself, the huntress who seeks not prey but meaning. She orders the work to be placed in the gardens, where moonlight can touch its face. To those who ask why, she simply replies, "Art should breathe." Under her guidance, the court's entertainments take on new dignity. Masks and ballets, once mere spectacles of opulence, become allegories of virtue and the frailty of pride. The courtiers, though they may not understand philosophy, feel something shift in the air. Even the king's pleasures grow thoughtful. When he sits beside her during performances, his expression softens. The weight of rule seems for an hour to lift. It is said that her presence refines him, that she turns his passions toward the service of harmony, but beyond this serenity lies a deeper purpose. Athénaïs senses that through art she can shape not only taste but conscience. She begins to support works that celebrate mercy, justice, and the quiet heroism of ordinary souls. When a young poet presents a verse honoring the soldiers' widows, she ensures it reaches the king's ear. When an artist paints a peasant family in simple dignity, she insists the work be hung near portraits of the nobility. Her influence begins to bridge the chasm between court and country, showing that beauty is not the privilege of the powerful, but the birthright of all who feel and dream. Paris, meanwhile, looks toward Versailles with a kind of reverence. In this version of history, there is less resentment, more curiosity. The salons of the capital mirror her tone, clever but kind, elegant without cruelty. The philosophers who gather in her name begin to speak of the soft monarchy, an age in which enlightenment might come not through rebellion, but through refinement. One writer calls her the hidden compass of the king. She does not seek credit. She simply smiles when she hears it, knowing that influence measured in silence endures longest. The queen, observing this transformation, feels both relief and awe. The court that once suffocated her with intrigue now breathes in rhythm with art and prayer. She and Athénaïs, though still bound by unspoken sorrow, find a delicate companionship in charity and devotion. Together, they establish a school for girls, teaching not only scripture but languages, music, and drawing, a gesture that quietly plants the seeds of future enlightenment. It is the kind of act that passes unnoticed in chronicles, but which alters the soul of a nation. As the decade unfolds, Europe takes notice. Ambassadors from Venice and Vienna write home that the French court has entered a golden harmony unseen since the ancients. Power here, one Venetian notes, moves as if to music. Even the king's commands seem sung rather than spoken. The image of France changes. Where once it was feared, it is now admired. This soft power, born not of cannons but of grace, becomes the true instrument of empire. And yet, within the perfection of this imagined world, a faint melancholy begins to hum beneath the surface. Athénaïs, ever attuned to rhythm, senses it. The applause of poets, the admiration of courtiers, they no longer delight her as before. She feels the slow passing of time, the invisible thinning of the thread that binds her to the king's heart. But instead of resisting it, she allows herself a new kind of acceptance. "If art survives us," she says one night to a trusted friend, "then perhaps we have not loved in vain." The narrator pauses, the tone deepening into quiet reverence. For what is art, if not the echo of our longing to endure? And what is patronage, if not an act of faith that beauty, once created, will speak for us when we are gone? Madame de Montespan, once a figure of scandal, has become in this alternate history the guardian of that faith. A woman who understood that true immortality lies not in power's grasp, but in the soft persistence of creation. Outside, the summer air of Versailles carries the scent of jasmine and stone. The fountains murmur like distant applause, their rhythm steady, eternal. Somewhere within the palace, musicians begin to play a new piece, delicate, melancholy, filled with light. Athénée listens from her balcony, her hands resting on the railing, her eyes lifted toward the stars. For a moment she feels them watching, not judging, not demanding, only witnessing. And in that stillness she understands that her work is not merely to adorn an age, but to ennoble it. The year is 1679, and Paris breathes uneasily beneath its painted calm. The salons glitter as ever, the theaters roar with laughter, yet beneath the perfume and powder, a darker scent has begun to rise. The scent of fear, of whispered names, of candles burning in secret rooms. It is the time of poisons, when superstition walks hand in hand with desperation, and the line between prayer and sorcery grows perilously thin. In our true history, this storm would consume Madame de Montespan, reducing her brilliance to ashes of accusation. But in this world, this gentler world we have imagined, the flame takes another course. Athénée first hears of it in passing, a rumor from one of her ladies who speaks of a fortune-teller arrested in the Rue de la Tannerie. At first she dismisses it as gossip, yet as the days pass, the stories multiply. Nobles seeking elixirs of love, mothers visiting alchemists to secure inheritance for their sons, whispers of powders that can silence rivals forever. What chills her most is not the horror of the act, but its familiarity. She has lived long enough among the courtiers to know how fear dresses itself in luxury. Beneath the jewels and the lace, the same hunger gnaws at every heart. The hunger to be loved, the terror of being forgotten. She decides to act. In this imagined history, rather than hiding or denying, she summons courage rare for her time. She goes directly to the king. The meeting takes place late at night, in a small salon where only the crackle of the fire interrupts their voices. Louis looks up from his papers, his expression weary. "They say this affair touches even the highest ranks," he murmurs. "That names dear to me are whispered in these accusations." She meets his gaze without flinching. "Then let us face it together, sire," she replies. "Truth cannot harm those who do not fear it." And so, side by side, they begin an inquiry, not of vengeance, but of cleansing. The tribunals still form, the prisons still fill, yet their tone changes. Instead of a purge driven by paranoia, it becomes an act of purification, a line drawn between madness and reason. The king, guided by her calm, resists the hysteria that might have devoured him. He forbids torture, orders mercy for the innocent, and commands that the trials remain hidden from public spectacle. Paris, expecting flames and confessions, receives instead silence, and in that silence, a kind of grace. The courtiers watch in awe. They had expected the marquise to tremble, to fall as others have fallen before her. But Athénée remains serene, her composure unbroken. She visits the chapels, donates to the hospitals, and receives petitioners with her usual warmth. The people notice. In taverns and markets, her name is spoken with renewed affection. She fears no shadow, they say, for her light is clean. Her enemies, robbed of scandal, find themselves disarmed. Even Madame de Maintenon, who has begun to gather quiet influence as the king's spiritual guide, cannot help but admire her courage. In private, however, the strain takes its toll. There are nights when Athénaïs sits alone by her window, the flame of a single candle trembling beside her. She stares into it as though it holds the face of destiny. The fire fascinates her, so alive, so delicate, so close to destruction. "How thin is the veil between warmth and ruin," she whispers, yet she never lets despair take her. Instead, she prays, not for absolution, but for clarity. "If this be the test," she writes in her journal, "then let me burn clean." The narrator's voice deepens here, for this is the crucible of her legend, the moment when passion is refined into wisdom. The king, too, changes. Watching her endure accusation with such dignity, he learns humility. He begins to see the fragility of power, the necessity of trust. The love between them, tested by suspicion, emerges transformed, less fevered, more profound. Where once he adored her beauty, now he venerates her courage. Where once he sought her laughter, now he listens to her silence. Under her influence, the court's moral climate shifts. The obsession with omens and astrologers wanes. The king issues an edict forbidding the use of poisons and charms, but instead of tyranny, he couches it in reason. "Superstition," the decree reads, "is the enemy of faith and of the state." The academies of science, newly favored, rise to prominence. Inquiry replaces fear. In this alternate France, the darkness that once would have swallowed Versailles becomes instead the catalyst of enlightenment. Athénaïs emerges from the storm with a new serenity. Her hair, once radiant gold, is now streaked with silver, and she wears it without shame. The courtiers who once worshipped her for youth now respect her for strength. Her salon becomes quieter, filled less with gossip and more with conversation. Philosophers debating morality, theologians exploring the balance between reason and grace. She listens to them with that same luminous patience that once captivated a king. "The soul," she says one evening, "is not purified by fire but by light. Fire destroys, light endures." The queen, hearing of her composure, sends word of friendship. The gesture, once unthinkable, is now natural. They meet in the chapel garden, two women bound by time and tenderness. No words of apology pass between them, only the shared silence of understanding. In their presence, even the air seems reconciled. The affair of the poisons, which in our reality left Versailles stained with dread, becomes in this world the moment of its moral awakening. Historians of later generations will call it the cleansing of the court, an episode that marked the end of superstition's reign and the birth of reason within monarchy. And at the center of it all stands Athénaïs, not the accused, not the fallen, but the Redeemer. As the narrator's voice softens, we are invited to imagine one last image, a woman standing at her window, watching dawn spread across the gardens. The candle beside her has burned to its end, but its light remains on her face, gentle and unafraid. Beyond the horizon, the first sunbeams catch the fountains, turning their spray into threads of gold. The storm has passed. The flame that might have consumed her has instead become her symbol, the alchemist's fire that transforms the heart. And with this transformation, the king's court steps into a new age where reason begins to walk beside faith, and love, tested by truth, becomes something unbreakable. The world turns, the day begins anew, and Versailles breathes once more. Radiant, renewed, reborn. By the early 1680s, Versailles has changed its song. The once restless court, with its rivalries and whispered intrigues, has grown quieter, its pulse steadier. The great fountains still leap in arcs of sunlight. The violins still play their courtly airs, but the laughter of excess has softened into contemplation. Louis XIV, now entering the maturity of his reign, begins to carry himself with the weight of wisdom rather than pride. The years of turmoil, The wars, the scandals, the poison trials have tempered him like iron in a slow fire, and standing beside him, no longer as lover alone but as confidant and compass, is Madame de Montespan, serene, reflective, transformed by all she has endured. Together they have emerged from shadow into light, and that light, filtered through understanding, illuminates an entire nation. There is a stillness in their companionship now, a depth that words no longer need to fill. When they walk through the gardens, they speak not of conquests or rivalries, but of the order of creation, of how the world itself seems to follow a pattern of grace, a pattern mirrored in the fountains and paths of Versailles. Everything, Athénaïs murmurs one afternoon as they pause by the Apollo basin, moves toward harmony when it remembers its center. The king, gazing at his reflection beside hers, feels for the first time not omnipotence, but humility, a recognition that power, if it is to endure, must imitate the balance of nature itself. This revelation begins to shape the rhythm of his rule. The Sun King, who once demanded absolute obedience, now listens. He attends longer to his ministers, invites the council of philosophers, and seeks to reconcile the grandeur of monarchy with the reason of governance. The France of this alternate world begins to breathe differently. Not yet the liberal age to come, but a gentler monarchy where thought and compassion have found their place at court. Madame de Montespan, far from fading into piety or exile, becomes his most trusted advisor in all matters, not of war, but of spirit. She reminds him, when pride stirs, that even the sun must set each day to rise again. The narrator's tone grows softer, more contemplative, as the age itself seems to pause in reflection. The courtiers, observing this change, find themselves drawn into new habits. Flattery loses its luster, conversation takes on weight. The salons echo with discussion of virtue, faith, and the duties of the powerful. Priests, once wielding threats of damnation, now speak of the kingdom of conscience. The shift is subtle but profound. The atmosphere of France, once heavy with the perfume of vanity, now carries the scent of thought. Under Athénaïs' influence, the king begins to look beyond the glitter of Versailles. He visits hospitals, orphanages, and farms, speaking directly to those who live far from the music of his court. Chroniclers record his surprise at their resilience, their quiet dignity. "They serve me with their labor," he says to her upon his return, "and I must serve them with my justice." It is a small sentence, but in it lies the seed of a monarch's moral awakening. She listens and smiles faintly, proud yet humbled by how the man she once taught to laugh has learned, at last, to see. In this reimagined France, the seeds of enlightenment are planted not in rebellion, but in compassion. Scholars from across Europe are invited to court, their works discussed openly. A young mathematician from Holland presents a theory on the motion of planets. A philosopher from England debates the nature of government. The king, once impatient with abstraction, now listens with genuine curiosity. He has become the philosopher sovereign, the ruler who seeks to understand before he commands. And through it all, Athénaïs remains at his side, the gentle flame guiding his reason. Their evenings together are quieter now. They dine privately, surrounded by candlelight that trembles upon old portraits and polished silver. Sometimes they read aloud, passages from Plutarch, from Augustine, from Pascal. Sometimes they speak of mortality, of how swiftly the brilliance of youth has faded into memory, yet neither regrets the passing of time. "To live long," she says one night, her eyes on the flicker of a candle, "is to learn how to surrender." He takes her hand in silence, understanding that surrender is not defeat, but peace. The courtiers, though respectful, feel the distance of this new intimacy. Versailles is no longer a stage of seduction. It has become a monastery of elegance, a school of virtue disguised in silk. The king's laughter is rarer, but when it comes, it carries warmth rather than arrogance. The poets call this new era the age of reasoned light. In their verses, Madame de Montespan appears as the gentle muse of moderation, the woman who turned desire into wisdom and power into thought. Yet even as harmony reigns, she feels the quiet ache of transience. The king's attention, though unwavering, is now divided between statecraft and faith. Madame de Maintenon, that steady and devout presence, begins to share in his hours of prayer. But unlike the jealous rivalries of history, this triangle unfolds in kindness. Athénais, now beyond the vanity of possession, sees in Maintenon a mirror of her own younger self, ardent, believing, full of purpose. She feels no hatred, only a wistful tenderness. Each of us, she writes in her journal, is but a candle in the same flame. The narrator lingers on this image, for it marks the culmination of her transformation. From laughter to wisdom, from beauty to serenity, Madame de Montespan has become the conscience of a king. Her presence infuses his reign with reflection, and through that reflection, France itself begins to glimpse its destiny. Roads are repaired, academies established, and charity given new dignity. The people who once saw in the monarchy only distance begin to feel its compassion. There's an evening, late, windless, the air heavy with the scent of lilac, when Louis and Athénais stand upon the terrace overlooking the Grand Canal. The sun has just set, and the sky glows with the fading gold of their youth. "Do you regret," he asks softly, "that we have grown old?" She turns to him with that familiar, patient smile. "Majesty," she replies, "the sun does not grow old, it merely changes its light." The king, moved beyond words, takes her hand as the first stars appear above the dark water. For a long time they stand there in silence, two figures framed against the night, their reflections trembling like memories in the rippling surface below. And so, the reign of reason begins, not through revolution, but through love, refined by suffering, through a woman's quiet wisdom, through a monarch's late humility. The France that rises from their union glows with an inner warmth, a balance between intellect and grace. The narrator's voice fades into stillness, like the dying chords of a harpsichord at dusk. "The philosopher king," he whispers, "is not the one who conquers the world, but the one who learns to listen to its soul." By the year 1684, a softer rhythm has settled over Versailles. The wars at the frontiers grow distant, replaced by the hum of learning, music, and the slow conversation of ideas. The king's court, once a furnace of vanity and intrigue, now breathes like a cathedral, steady, luminous, filled with the faint echo of wisdom. And within this gentler air move the children of Madame de Montespan, once hidden from view, now walking openly through the galleries of their father's house. In our true history, they were shadows, legitimized, yes, but always marked by scandal. Yet in this reimagined world, they are not burdens of guilt, but instruments of grace, the visible heirs of love purified by understanding. They are, as poets will later call them, the children of light. The eldest, Louis Auguste, Duke of Maine, inherits his mother's intellect and his father's dignity. From his earliest lessons, it is clear that he carries both ambition and conscience in equal measure. He studies under scholars of the Académie, guided not only by politics, but by philosophy. Athénais insists that he learn humility alongside command, telling him, "To rule is to listen." The king, proud yet cautious, watches the boy with complex emotion, seeing in him both a continuation of his own blood and a quiet redemption of his past. The Duke becomes known for his mildness, his generosity toward soldiers, and his curiosity about all things mechanical. In this alternate world, he grows into a man admired rather than feared, his life unburdened by the bitterness that haunted the bastards of kings. The younger children, too, find their places in this luminous order. Louise Françoise, the most spirited of them, inherits her mother's laughter, but with it, her wisdom. She becomes a patroness of artists, hosting salons where poets, scientists, and philosophers converse as equals. It is said that her wit can disarm even the most solemn theologian. One evening, when a visiting Jesuit attempts to lecture her on obedience, she smiles and replies, "I have learned that the highest obedience is to truth." The court, startled into silence, later repeats the phrase as if it were a line from Racine. In her hands, the legacy of her mother's spirit becomes not scandal, but culture, a bridge between reason and charm. Athénée herself looks upon her children with a calm that only age can bring. The fever of ambition that once drove her has cooled into devotion. She no longer dreams of thrones or triumphs. She dreams of continuity, of leaving behind not monuments, but souls capable of gentleness. "We are not made," she writes in her journal, "to conquer the world, but to teach it how to endure itself." She sees in her children the fulfillment of that hope. Their presence at court, once a source of tension, has become a quiet reassurance. Even the queen, whose heart was once pierced by their existence, now treats them with kindness. Time, that great reconciler, has turned pain into affection. Louis XIII, too, feels this transformation. He finds in his children something he never expected to possess, the possibility of innocence renewed. The king, who once ruled as if immortal, now begins to understand succession, not as inheritance of power, but of virtue. He spends hours walking with them in the gardens, explaining the geometry of fountains, the logic of state, the poetry of architecture. His voice, once commanding, has grown patient. "A kingdom," he tells them, "is like these trees. You do not own their shade, you only plant them for those who come after." In that single phrase, the autocrat becomes philosopher, the father becomes teacher. The narrator's voice slows here to let the image unfold. The king, his children, and Madame de Montespan strolling together beneath the evening light. The fountains murmur softly, and the air carries the scent of orange blossoms. The courtiers watch from a distance, moved yet uncertain, for they have never seen such simplicity within the court's grandeur. It is as if Versailles itself has taken a breath of humility. Beyond the palace, the ripples of this harmony spread. The nobility begin to imitate the royal family's gentler manners. Families take pride not only in lineage but in learning. Schools for orphans and daughters of the poor multiply, many under the patronage of the king's children. Where once fear of sin ruled, now curiosity blooms. The church, seeing the moral renewal of the court, finds less cause for reproach. The sermons that once thundered against vanity now praise charity and grace. For Athénée, these are years of inward peace. The years of striving are behind her. The years of remembrance have begun. Her beauty, though softened by age, carries a new kind of radiance, the serenity that comes from knowing one has survived both love and judgment. Sometimes in the quiet hours after evening prayers, she writes letters to her children, urging them toward compassion. "Never believe," she tells them, "that greatness lies in commanding. It lies in understanding. The heart that listens rules the world more surely than the hand that strikes." Louis, reading her words in secret, feels the quiet ache of admiration and regret. He knows that his reign, though still strong, is finite, and that his truest legacy may not be his palaces or laws, but the spirit that this woman has woven into the souls of their children. He sees in them the reflection of her better nature, a light he might never have discovered without her. And so, Versailles becomes more than a monument of marble and gold. It becomes a cradle of minds. The sons and daughters of France, inspired by the example of their sovereigns, begin to question without rebellion, to think without defiance, to dream without despair. The arts and sciences flourish together, like branches of the same tree, reaching toward the same sun. The narrator allows a long pause here, letting the audience imagine that luminous generation. The poets writing by candlelight, the scholars tracing stars upon parchment, the young noblewomen reading Latin verses beside windows where dawn slowly breaks. Athénès sometimes sits among them, quietly listening. Her hands, once adorned with jewels, now rest upon books. Her laughter, softer now, still fills the air with that same warmth it carried in youth. Yet beneath it lingers the melancholy of one who has glimpsed both the heights and the fragility of glory. She knows that nothing endures forever, not love, not power, not beauty. But she has learned that the echo of goodness lasts longer than the noise of triumph. As the evening light deepens over Versailles, the king joins her in the garden. Together they watch their children playing near the fountains, their voices rising like birdsong. For a moment, neither speaks. Then Louis says quietly, "You were right, Athénès. It is not conquest that preserves a throne, but kindness." She looks at him with the gentlest of smiles. "Majesty," she replies, "the heart learns what the crown cannot teach." The words hang in the air, tender and timeless, until the sound of the fountain swallows them whole. And so, in this imagined France, the next generation grows beneath the light of two souls transformed. A king who has learned mercy, and a woman who has found peace in wisdom. Their children will carry both their strengths, walking between the world of power and the world of thought, heirs to a love that, purified by suffering, has become a quiet legacy. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper, like a candle burning low. "From fire they were born," he murmurs, "but they chose to shine as stars." By the late 1680s, Versailles stands at the height of its glory, its vast halls echoing with music and its mirrored walls reflecting not merely wealth, but time itself. The fleeting shimmer of an age that knows it is passing. The Sun King, though still radiant in dignity, has entered the long shadow of reflection. The gold that once blazed from his every gesture now gleams more softly, tempered by memory, and beside him, still poised, still luminous, walks Madame de Montespan. The courtiers who once expected her to fade into exile or penance find instead a woman transfigured by serenity. The great scandal that history promised her never arrives. Instead of falling from favor, she gently steps down from the throne of passion into the calm seat of wisdom. And in doing so, she conquers time itself. Her apartments remain open, but no longer as a stage for triumph. The musicians play quieter airs, the gatherings are smaller, the conversations deeper. Those who enter her salon come not to flatter, but to listen. She speaks little now, yet every word carries the weight of reflection. Even her laughter, that sound once bright as a bell, has deepened into a tone that seems to understand sorrow as part of joy. The young ladies who attend her learn not only the arts of grace and conversation, but the discipline of kindness. There is no elegance, she tells them, greater than mercy. And when she walks through the corridors, even those who once envied her bow their heads with quiet respect, as if acknowledging not her beauty, but her endurance. Madame de Maintenon, now a constant presence in the king's spiritual life, regards her not as an adversary, but as an equal in faith. The two women, so different in temperament, find in one another a kind of completion. Maintenon, austere and devout, tempers the king's conscience. Montespan, warm and wise, softens his heart. It is said that they sometimes pray together in the chapel, their heads bowed, their hands unadorned. Between them lies not rivalry, but an unspoken understanding. That love, once transformed by sacrifice, becomes something closer to grace. The courtiers who witness their companionship cannot comprehend it, for it defies the logic of ambition. Yet perhaps, the narrator muses, only those who have suffered love's full measure can truly forgive it. Louis, now in the maturity of his reign, feels the comfort of their dual guidance. The king who once ruled as an absolute sovereign has become a man of introspection. His wars have lessened, his decrees have grown gentler. The once restless monarch spends his evenings in quiet contemplation, reading scripture or philosophy. When Athenaeus enters, he greets her not with the ardor of old, but with the tenderness reserved for a companion of the soul. "You have changed me," he tells her one evening, "more than victory or faith ever could." She smiles faintly. "Then we have both been conquered, sire," she replies, and the two sit together in silence, listening to the wind whisper through the marble halls. The world beyond Versailles takes notice. Foreign ambassadors, who once sought favor through flattery, now speak admiringly of the king's serenity and of the lady who helped bring it about. The poets of Paris, sensing a change in the nation's spirit, begin to write verses of humility and peace. Even the clergy, long suspicious of her influence, now preach her virtues. If the sinner, one confessor declares from the pulpit of Saint-Sulpice, can become the teacher of virtue, then redemption is not a miracle, but a choice. The people, hearing this, begin to speak of her as La Dame apaisée, the lady of calm. Time, however, remains the one master unappeased. Athenaeus feels its slow approach not as cruelty, but as release. Her beauty, though softened, has not vanished. It is transformed into something almost translucent, a light that comes from within rather than without. She dresses now in softer colors, wears fewer jewels, and spends her mornings in the garden, feeding the swans that glide upon the still waters. Those who see her there speak of a presence that seems both near and distant, like a memory that refuses to fade. She has become a figure of contemplation, and yet she is not melancholy. In her old age, she has learned to love stillness. "We rush toward our desires," she once says to Maintenon, "only to learn that peace was walking beside us all the while." These words, repeated through the corridors, become a kind of quiet proverb at court. Even the king begins to quote her. When asked by a minister why he no longer wages war, he answers, "Because Madame has taught me the cost of conquest." And those who hear it understand that his reign has entered a new season, one of reflection, not expansion. The narrator's voice lingers now, slower, more deliberate, as if walking gently through a memory. The great palace, once vibrating with ambition, has become an echo of its own grandeur. The mirrors reflect not only faces, but time. Faces older, wiser, more human. The courtiers, stripped of their illusions, begin to discover that behind the splendor lies a yearning for something purer than glory, meaning. Madame de Montespan, once the symbol of worldly desire, has become its quiet cure. One evening, as twilight descends over the Grand Canal, she walks alone along the terrace. The fountains have been stilled for the night. The marble statues glow faintly in the last light. The air is cool, scented with water and roses. She pauses, hearing the distant bells of the chapel calling the faithful to prayer. For a moment, she closes her eyes. Her life passes before her. The laughter of youth, the ecstasy of love, the bitterness of scandal, the long years of reflection. Yet she feels no regret. Everything has led her here, to this moment of luminous peace. To have loved greatly, she whispers to the dusk, is to have touched eternity. From the upper windows, the king watches her, his heart heavy with a tenderness beyond words. He knows that her time, like his, is drawing toward its close, yet there is no tragedy in it. Their story, once the stuff of gossip and sermon, has become a quiet testament, a lesson that love, if refined by forgiveness, can outlast its own desire. The courtiers who see them together at supper that night remark on the calm between them, a silence that seems older than speech. They do not know it, but they are witnessing something rare, a love that has transcended passion to become wisdom, a bond that has survived the slow erosion of time. And so, the fall that history once promised never comes. Instead, there is descent into gentleness, the kind of descent that is not defeat, but completion. The woman who might have been remembered for scandal becomes instead a symbol of reconciliation. The king, who might have been remembered only for pride, becomes a figure of grace. Together they embody the strange, miraculous truth that redemption is not the erasure of sin, but its transformation into understanding. The narrator's voice softens into near silence as the candles of Versailles flicker against the approaching night. The world, he murmurs, loves to watch the mighty fall, but sometimes the greater miracle is when they simply learn to rest. And in that stillness, the palace breathes, less like a monument, more like a living soul, glowing not with the light of conquest, but with the quiet afterglow of forgiveness. The new decade opens with a quieter sun. Versailles, once the restless heart of ambition, now radiates a tempered brilliance, not the blinding glare of conquest, but the warm, measured light of example. France has grown still in its grandeur, sure of itself in the calm that follows wisdom. Across Europe, kings and princes turn their eyes toward this astonishing transformation, unable to decide whether they are witnessing decline or perfection. For decades, the Sun King's power had commanded awe. Now, his restraint commands respect. The courtiers whisper that the king has grown philosophical, and that the woman who once stirred his blood now stirs his conscience. But beyond gossip and envy, there is a deeper truth unfolding. Louis and Athénaïs have taught Europe that even power can grow old gracefully. Ambassadors arriving at court are struck first not by splendor, but by serenity. The receptions are still magnificent. The marble floors polished, the gilded ceilings glowing. Yet there is a new dignity in the air, an absence of frenzy. The banquets begin earlier and end sooner. Conversation replaces performance. The king, seated beside Madame de Montespan, listens more than he speaks, and when he does, his words are measured, almost meditative. He no longer boasts of wars or victories. He speaks instead of gardens, of harmony, of the duty of rulers to preserve rather than destroy. Some find it disarming, others disquieting. The sun no longer burns, one Venetian envoy writes home, but he gives life still. The example spreads. In Vienna, the Habsburg emperor, long jealous of French supremacy, begins to imitate the temperance of Versailles. His court reforms its manners, softening its rigid protocol to encourage conversation and intellect. In London, the philosophers of the new Royal Society speak of France not as a rival, but as a model of enlightened monarchy. Even in distant St. Petersburg, young envoys carry tales of this radiant calm, of a king who rules by reason, of a woman once feared who has become the living emblem of mercy. Europe, long accustomed to the thunder of France's cannons, now listens to the murmur of her conscience. Athénaïs, though she seldom leaves the palace, feels the ripple of her influence. Letters arrive from queens and duchesses seeking her counsel, advice not on fashion or intrigue, but on charity, on education, on the art of keeping dignity in the midst of power. She answers each with patient warmth, her handwriting steady, her tone maternal. Grace, she writes to one young sovereign, is not softness. It is the courage to remain kind when one no longer needs to be. These letters, later published after her death, circulate through Europe as quiet manifestos of virtue. For the first time, the idea takes hold that a woman's influence in politics need not come from seduction, but from wisdom. Meanwhile, Versailles itself becomes a kind of academy. Philosophers are invited to lecture in the salons once reserved for dancers. Musicians perform compositions inspired not by flattery but by faith in harmony. Painters depict not mythic victories but moments of tenderness. The king blessing a child, Madame reading beside a window, a servant watering flowers in the royal garden. These images travel across Europe, carried by engravers and envoys, reshaping how the continent imagines monarchy. Power, they suggest, need not roar to be obeyed. It can whisper and still be heard. Yet not all approve. Some ministers grumble that France has grown too gentle, too inward. The generals mutter that the spirit of conquest has been replaced by a woman's sentiment. But Louis, smiling faintly, silences them. "Let them mock," he says. "The sword rusts sooner than the mind." Athenæus, hearing this, feels a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but the deep relief of one who sees her long labor of transformation completed. The man who once sought dominion now seeks understanding. The world beyond the palace walls may not yet be at peace, but the heart of the kingdom has learned to breathe again. The narrator's voice slows, lingering on the image of the king and Madame, standing together at the balcony during a diplomatic reception. Below them, envoys from Spain, England, and the Empire move through the gardens like chess pieces in sunlight. The fountains play, the music drifts, and the two figures above, older, graver, but still radiant, watch silently, as if aware that their gaze itself has become a form of governance. They no longer need to command. Their very presence orders the world around them. In private, they speak often of legacy. The king worries not about monuments, but about meaning. "When they remember us," he tells her one night, "will they say we built too much, ruled too long?" Athenæus smiles. "They will say," she replies, "that we learned to end as we began, in light." Her answer pleases him, though he knows the truth is larger still. They have changed the definition of majesty, turned power from spectacle into philosophy. Versailles, which once mirrored only the king's vanity, now reflects the maturity of an entire civilization. Outside France, the shift ripples through thought itself. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, still unborn in our true history, begin their musings earlier in this altered world. Letters from Paris carry not the gossip of courtiers, but the reflections of scholars. The word reason becomes fashionable in drawing rooms. The phrase moral grandeur begins to appear in pamphlets. The age of light begins, not as rebellion, but as evolution. And though none will say it openly, many trace its origins to the quiet transformation of a woman's influence, the laughter of a girl from Poitou, that, across the decades, softened a king, and through him, softened a continent. There are evenings now when the king and Madame dine alone, their table placed near an open window. The air smells of rain and jasmine. Somewhere beyond the gardens, thunder murmurs faintly. They speak of distant lands, of new sciences, of the stars whose light travels centuries before reaching the earth. Perhaps, Athenæus muses, the good we do travels the same way, unseen, unhurried, yet sure to arrive. The king, moved, reaches across the table and takes her hand. For a long time, they sit in silence, listening to the rain begin to fall, feeling its rhythm like the pulse of time itself. Europe watches, but cannot quite grasp what it sees. For how does one describe a miracle of moderation? The rulers who imitate Louis do so imperfectly, mistaking calm for weakness, grace for hesitation. But history will know the difference. When later generations speak of France's golden age, they will not recall only its art or its armies, but its poise, that delicate balance of pride and peace. And at the heart of that memory, they will find two figures, side by side in the fading light, who proved that even the most powerful can be redeemed by gentleness. The narrator's voice fades to a murmur, rich with the calm of twilight. The sun, he says, does not cease to shine when it lowers toward the horizon. It simply learns to warm the earth, rather than dazzle it. And so, as Europe watches, the light of Versailles spreads outward, slower, deeper, wiser, illuminating not through conquest, but through example. By the 1690s, time has etched its quiet script upon every marble surface of Versailles. The palace remains magnificent, yet its brilliance has mellowed, its mirrors reflecting more memory than vanity. The courtiers, older now, move with a gentler rhythm. The music is slower, the laughter subdued. The king himself walks more deliberately, his step still stately but no longer triumphant. The great fountains which once seemed to proclaim his eternal youth now sound almost meditative, their murmurs recalling the passing of seasons. And in those mirrors that line the Hall of Glory, the faces that once glittered with ambition have grown lined, contemplative, aware of how swiftly grandeur fades. Madame de Montespan feels this change as intimately as breath. The woman who once dazzled the court with her beauty and wit now spends her mornings in silence, writing, reading, or gazing into the gardens she helped to shape. The world still calls her beautiful, but the reflection that meets her in the glass no longer feels like herself. The mirror has become both friend and confessor, reminding her that every charm, however bright, bends before time, yet she does not turn away. Each morning she looks directly into it, as if to acknowledge, without vanity, without fear, that what remains is more than what is faded. "I have lost my bloom," she once says to a friend, "but not my light." There is a strange peace in this acceptance. The mirror, once her ally in conquest, now becomes her companion in wisdom. It shows her not what she was, but what she has become. A woman who has lived through the full arc of fortune and survived with her dignity intact. The court sees it too. When she enters a salon now, the room falls silent, not in the awe of desire, but in reverence. The younger women look upon her not as a rival, but as a relic of grace, a living reminder that beauty, when joined with humility, can outlast the decades. Even Madame de Maintenon, who has long shared the king's spiritual life, holds her in quiet esteem. "She has learned," Maintenon says one evening, "the most difficult of virtues, peace with oneself." The king, meanwhile, has entered that late season of life when the mask of power begins to slip, revealing the man beneath. He still carries himself with grandeur, still believes in ceremony, yet the old certainty has softened into reflection. He spends hours in his private chapel, praying not for victory, but for forgiveness. Sometimes he confides to Athénaïs that the mirror frightens him, that he sees in it both the glory of France and the cost of pride. "We built a paradise," he tells her one night, "and forgot it was made of dust." She answers gently, "Majesty, dust is what God uses to make stars." It is in such moments that their companionship takes on a sacred quality. No longer lovers, not quite mere friends, they share a tenderness that belongs only to those who have seen each other through every disguise. Their affection, once bright and consuming, has become the quiet light that fills a room after the candles are extinguished. Invisible, yet everywhere present. Sometimes they walk together through the gardens at dusk, saying nothing. The fountains whisper, the wind carries the scent of roses, and between them stretches not distance, but understanding. Versailles itself seems to breathe in rhythm with their transformation. The architects and painters who once glorified conquest now turn toward serenity. The frescoes depict not war but peace. The sculptures show not gods in triumph, but men in contemplation. The mirrors, those silent witnesses to a century's vanity, now catch softer scenes. An old king blessing a servant, a lady reading beside a window, a child chasing a swan through the reeds. The palace, once the stage of power, has become a temple of remembrance. The narrator's tone deepens, slower now, as if the story itself has aged alongside its subjects. Time, he says, has stripped away the mask from every face, revealing not ugliness, but truth. And the truth, in this world, is tender. The courtiers who once competed for favor now gather in small circles to share verses, to speak of philosophy, to reflect on the nature of the soul. The kingdom of France, once ruled by spectacle, has discovered inwardness. It is as though the entire realm has looked into its own mirror and found the courage to see. Athenaeus writes less often now, but her journal grows more profound. The mirror, she notes, shows the body's decline, but not the soul's ascent. What fades in flesh is reborn in spirit. She begins to sense her place not as ornament, but as lesson. Visitors come to seek her counsel: widows, artists, young mothers, even soldiers returning from the frontier. They speak to her not as to a courtier, but as to a philosopher. Her room, once perfumed with roses, now smells of parchment and candle wax. When she speaks, her words are slow and deliberate, carrying that rare calm that only comes from having survived oneself. There is, however, a certain ache in her serenity. She misses laughter, not the laughter of derision or triumph, but the spontaneous sound of joy unburdened by reflection. Sometimes, alone in her chamber, she hums the melodies of her youth, fragments of old ballets, bits of songs that once played in the mirrored hall. It is not nostalgia that moves her, but gratitude. She understands better than anyone that even vanity had its place in the architecture of her life. Without it, she might never have discovered humility. Without her mirror, she might never have learned to see her soul. The king feels the same ache. He, too, lives with the ghosts of what once was, the vanished faces of friends, ministers, lovers. In the evenings when he passes the great mirrors of the hall, he sometimes stops to look, not at himself, but at the reflections of candles receding into infinity. So passes glory, he murmurs, from one flame to another. When he visits Athenaeus, he no longer speaks of affairs of state. They talk instead of eternity, of the hope that love, once purified of pride, might survive death. She listens, nodding gently, her eyes calm as moonlight on water. And so, in this imagined history, the mirror becomes not a symbol of vanity, but of revelation. The king and madame, having worn every mask of human desire, now stand unmasked before one another, before God, before time. They are no longer what the world made them, but what they have made of themselves. Two souls, once bound by passion, now united in peace. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. The mask, he says, was never falsehood, only preparation. We must all wear one until we are ready to see our true reflection. And as night gathers over Versailles, the mirrors fade into darkness, holding within them the faint eternal image of two figures walking side by side. A king and a woman, no longer seeking the light, for they have become it. The final decade of the century arrives with a gentleness that few could have predicted. The wars are distant, the ministers subdued, and the court, once a theater of rivalry, has become a sanctuary of reflection. Versailles no longer burns with the fever of ambition. It glows with the steady warmth of civility, of reason, of restraint. The great doors open each morning to scholars, architects, and reformers rather than flatterers and adventurers. Louis XIV, the man who once declared that he was the state, has grown into a ruler who listens, questions, and seeks to serve. This transformation, subtle yet profound, spreads quietly through France like the first light of dawn. It is not a revolution of blood, but of thought, born not from rebellion but from tenderness. At its heart, as always, stands Madame de Montespan. Though her public role has waned, her influence has only deepened. From her apartments, now modest in ornament but rich in conversation, she gathers minds that seek to renew the kingdom without breaking it. Priests, mathematicians, poets, and young courtiers alike come to her salons to debate the nature of goodness and the responsibilities of power. Her tone is calm, her authority effortless. She speaks with the patience of one who has lived through extremes and learned that truth resides between them. "Every law," she says one evening, "must begin with mercy, or it ends in tyranny." The words are repeated throughout the palace, carried in whispers, then written down in notes, until even the king's ministers quote her without realizing it. Louis listens from afar. Age has quieted his passions, but sharpened his awareness. The reforms that unfold in these years bear his signature, but carry her spirit. Taxes are revised with leniency toward the poor. Schools for girls multiply. The hospitals, once grim with neglect, receive new funding and care. The Académie des Sciences expands, welcoming physicians, astronomers, and engineers who speak of progress not as vanity, but as gratitude, a desire to perfect the world as an act of devotion. The arts flourish again, but their subjects have changed. No longer the triumphs of kings, but the dignity of ordinary life. Painters depict mothers teaching children to read, workers building bridges, old men resting in sunlight. France, for the first time in centuries, begins to see beauty not only in the royal, but in the human. The narrator's voice lingers here, inviting the listener to imagine the subtle texture of this transformation. The sound of pens scratching upon paper, the hum of conversation in candle-lit rooms, the scent of books newly printed, ink still wet. It is the music of awakening, quiet but unstoppable. The priests who once thundered against vanity now speak of charity and reason. The nobles who once prided themselves on lineage now boast of learning. The world is changing softly, under the steady guidance of a woman who once embodied desire and now teaches discernment. Athénée herself feels this new age stirring in her heart. She is old now, yet her mind burns brighter than ever. She spends long hours writing letters to abbesses, to provincial teachers, to women who seek her example. The mind, she tells them, has no rank, and the heart has no title. Her words begin to circulate beyond France, translated into Spanish, Italian, and even English. A new idea takes root, that virtue and intellect are not privileges of men, but gifts shared by all. And though she would never claim to be a philosopher, her influence becomes philosophical all the same. Louis, observing her, feels both pride and melancholy. The monarch who once ruled through spectacle now rules through simplicity. He prays more, eats little, sleeps sparingly. His face is thin, his gaze inward, yet when he speaks, it is with a lucidity that moves even his enemies. "We have built too many walls," he tells his council one day, "and too few bridges." None dare answer, for they know the words have been born not in strategy, but in conscience. His decrees grow shorter, his silences longer. France feels his transformation like the changing of a tide, imperceptible, yet irresistible. Outside the palace, the ripples widen. The academies and salons of Paris begin to speak more boldly. Writers dare to question dogma, though with reverence rather than defiance. The young Voltaire, still a boy in this world, will later write that it was in these quiet years that France learned the art of thinking freely without rebelling fiercely. And though history will name others as the architects of enlightenment, the seed was planted here, in a woman's drawing room, beside a window overlooking the gardens of Versailles, where kindness and reason met and found themselves identical. The narrator's tone softens further, as though lowering his voice to match the stillness of the age. It was, he says, a revolution without drums, a dawn without thunder. Indeed, the change unfolds so gently that those living within it hardly notice. Yet the air of France has altered. The conversations of its people have changed. The courtiers who once spoke of jewels now speak of justice. The merchants, once fearful of the crown, begin to see it as guardian rather than master. The clergy, following the king's own humility, embrace simplicity. Even the peasants who rarely hear of such matters feel it in small ways: lighter taxes, fairer judgments, and the rare but real experience of being seen. Athenais, watching all this from the quiet of her apartments, feels both joy and fatigue. She knows the work of her life is nearly done. Sometimes at night she walks through the corridors when the palace sleeps. The torches flicker against the gilded walls, and her footsteps echo softly like a heartbeat. She thinks of the girl she once was, the laughing, restless child who dreamed of grandeur. She thinks of the woman she became, who held the love of a king and the envy of a nation. And she thinks of the soul she is now, stripped of vanity but clothed in peace. "I asked for power," she writes in one of her final letters, "and life gave me understanding instead. I think it is the greater gift." The king reads those words and keeps them near him always. He knows she is right. Power had been his youth's armor, but wisdom is his age's redemption. He visits her often, and though they speak little, their silences are full of gratitude. When he leaves her one evening, he pauses at the door, turns, and says, "You have changed the kingdom, Athenais." She smiles faintly. "No, Majesty, we only remembered what it means to be human." The narrator lets the scene linger, the closing of the door, the sound of distant fountains, the night pressing gently upon the windows of Versailles. The world outside is shifting, the old order softening beneath the touch of new thought. Yet within these walls there is only quiet, the quiet of fulfillment, of completion, of light that has learned to glow rather than blaze. It is this light, the narrator concludes, that will guide France into its next century. Not the fire of revolution, but the lamp of reflection. The philosophers who come after will speak of reason, equality, and progress, never knowing that their dawn began here, in the evening calm of a king and his muse. And so, the quiet revolution continues, not in the streets, but in the heart. The first years of the new century unfold like the slow descent of an evening sun. Versailles, once the heart of a kingdom that pulsed with youth and ambition, now lies bathed in a soft, perpetual dusk. The great fountains still rise, the music still echoes faintly through the corridors, but the air carries the weight of remembrance. The courtiers walk more slowly, their laughter sounds like echoes of another time. And the king, the man who had made himself the very symbol of glory, has grown thin and pale, his movements deliberate, his gaze distant, as though already half-turned toward eternity. In this long twilight, grandeur gives way to grace, and what remains is not the noise of power, but the quiet music of reflection. Madame de Montespan, too, has entered her final season. The years have taken their toll on her body, but refined her spirit into something almost luminous. Her hair, once gold, now gleams silver in the candlelight. Her once laughter-filled voice has become low and musical, each word measured, as if spoken to last. She no longer seeks the world's attention. She has discovered that the truest presence is one that leaves room for silence. Each morning she wakes before dawn, opens her window to the gardens, and breathes in the scent of dew and earth. She watches the first light touch the statues and trees, and she feels, perhaps more than ever, at peace with creation. Everything, she writes, returns to stillness, not in sorrow but in fulfillment. Even the sun must learn to set. The king still visits her when health and duty permit. Their meetings are quieter now, stripped of ceremony. He enters her apartments without fanfare. She rises to greet him with a gentle smile. They no longer speak of the affairs of the realm, nor of the past, nor of what might have been. They talk instead of small things. The progress of the gardens, the weather, a favorite book, a memory of laughter long ago. Between their words lies an understanding that requires no speech. Theirs is the companionship of two souls who have seen everything, lost everything, and found what cannot be taken: peace. The palace around them begins to resemble their mood. The walls, once gleaming with new gilding, show signs of age. The marble floors bear the faint wear of a century's footsteps. Yet the beauty of Versailles has never been more profound. It no longer dazzles. It consoles. Visitors arriving from foreign courts remark on this strange, tender grandeur, this sense that the palace itself is alive with memory. One diplomat from Vienna writes, "Versailles does not impress the senses, it moves the soul. It is the mirror of a king who has learned to grow old." Athenaeus rarely appears in public now. When she does, she is greeted not as a royal favorite, but as a living legend. The young courtiers, who know her only through portraits and stories, are astonished by her simplicity. Gone are the elaborate silks and jewels. She dresses in soft gray or blue, her only ornament a small gold cross around her neck. Yet her presence has not diminished. When she enters a room, conversation slows, and people feel the strange hush that accompanies genuine reverence. The queen has long since passed into memory. Madame de Maintenon, steady in her piety, presides over the king's devotions. But it is Athenaeus who remains the soul of his recollection, the thread connecting his mortal life to all that was once vivid within it. There are evenings now when she walks alone through the hall of mirrors, her steps echoing softly against the marble. She pauses before the glass where hundreds of candles shimmer in reflection and sees her own figure multiplied into infinity. A woman no longer young, yet strangely eternal. "We do not disappear," she murmurs to herself. "We are simply repeated by memory." She understands, as few do, that legacy is not built by monuments, but by the impressions we leave in the minds of others. The king, who once believed his glory would last in marble and gold, now begins to understand this too. In this imagined France, the twilight of their lives becomes a kind of golden afterglow for the kingdom. The reforms they nurtured have taken root. The tone of the court has changed from vanity to virtue. The academies thrive, the schools flourish, and even the church, softened by their example, begins to preach with gentler voice. The people, though still bound by hardship, feel a new dignity. "The king has grown human," they say in the villages, "and so we may be human too." The narrator's voice slows, rich with melancholy and warmth, allowing the listener to feel that deep, lingering light, the kind that rests upon the horizon just before night fully falls. Athenaeus spends her last years in correspondence, her handwriting delicate but unwavering. Her letters, later collected and published, are filled with reflections on life's impermanence and the grace found in acceptance. "Do not fear the end," she writes in one, "for it is only the beginning remembered." She offers counsel not in dogma, but in tenderness, urging her readers to see love as the only true form of endurance. When she writes to her son, now a respected statesman, she reminds him that strength without compassion is merely disguise. "Govern hearts," she tells him, "and you will govern the world." The king reads these letters often, alone at night. His hands tremble slightly as he traces the ink, as though by touching the words he could summon the warmth of her voice once more. He knows she is fading, and he feels in his bones that his own time is drawing near. Yet he does not despair. For all his fears of mortality, he senses that her wisdom has prepared him for this final journey. In her serenity, he sees his own redemption reflected, the final gift she has given him, greater than beauty, greater even than love. One afternoon, he visits her for the last time. The day is quiet, the sky a pale blue, the gardens hushed beneath the soft rustle of leaves. She is sitting by the window, a book in her lap, the sunlight resting gently upon her hair. When he enters, she smiles. They speak little. He tells her of the latest music performed in the chapel, of the young philosophers whose writings have begun to reach the court. She listens, nodding, her eyes calm. "The world is moving forward, Majesty," she says softly. "That is all we ever hoped." When he rises to leave, he takes her hand and holds it for a long moment. "You have been my conscience," he whispers. "Then I have done my duty," she answers. That evening, as the king walks back through the gardens, the first stars begin to appear above the still water. The fountains murmur like distant prayers. He pauses, looks upward, and feels the immensity of the sky. The same sky that had once watched over his triumphs, now watching over his humility. And somewhere, behind a window of Versailles, a candle burns low, its flame bending but not yet extinguished. The narrator's voice falls almost to a whisper. "The twilight years," he says, "are not the end of the day, but its gentlest hour, when light before departing reveals its truest color. And in that light we see them as they are, two souls at peace, their shadows long upon the marble floor, their hearts reconciled to time." The final winter of Madame de Montespan's life comes quietly, wrapped not in drama but in stillness. The air of Versailles carries that particular hush which precedes the close of an age, a hush filled with memory, not mourning. The courtiers move softly through the corridors now, their voices subdued, their laughter rare. The king, aged and solemn, keeps mostly to his chapel and his studies, while the once mighty marquise, now frail but luminous, withdraws into her chamber like a flame burning low yet steady. She is not forgotten, nor banished, but revered, a presence so familiar that the palace itself seems to breathe in rhythm with her remaining hours. She spends her days writing. The ink trembles faintly on the page, but her thoughts are clear, her sentences strong and measured. Each letter is written with the calm of one who has already made peace with both heaven and earth. Her correspondence is no longer for the court. It is for the world that will come after her. One letter, addressed to her eldest son, will outlive them all. She begins it at dawn, her window open to the pale light that spreads across the gardens. The words flow without hesitation, as if dictated by the quiet voice of time itself. "My dear child," she writes, "when you read these lines, I shall already have returned to the silence that waits for us all. Do not weep for me. A mother's life is not a story of possession, but of passing. We borrow our days to teach others how to use theirs. Remember always that love is not a chain, but a light. It does not bind, it illuminates. Whatever power you hold, use it with gentleness, for greatness without kindness is the heaviest of burdens. And when you look upon the poor, or the weak, or those who have fallen, see in them not your subjects but your reflections. All that we are given, my son, is a chance to rise above ourselves." She pauses, resting her hand upon the paper. Outside, the wind stirs through the branches, scattering the last of the winter leaves. She dips her pen again and continues. "Tell your sisters that I have loved them beyond all measure, though life often taught me through silence rather than speech. Tell them that laughter, if used kindly, is a prayer. Tell them that beauty fades, but the grace with which we let it go becomes our final adornment. And tell the king, if God allows him to hear these words, that he was, in truth, the greatest gift and the greatest lesson of my life. For through loving him, I learned both the heights of joy and the depths of humility. May he find in memory the peace he once sought in glory." When the letter is finished, she seals it with wax, presses her trembling fingers upon the seal, and sets it aside. Then she sits back, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent prayer. She does not ask for miracles or for absolution. She prays only that her children will live in a gentler world, one where wisdom is not born of suffering. The faintest smile touches her face, as though she can already see that world unfolding beyond her sight. The king, informed of her weakening state, comes to her that same afternoon. He is carried now more by memory than by strength. His once commanding step has become a slow, reverent tread. When he enters, she looks up from her chair, and for a moment they see each other not as ruler and mistress, not as penitent and priest, but as two weary travelers who have walked the same long road. He kneels beside her, taking her hand in both of his. For a while, neither speaks. The light from the window falls across their faces, and the silence between them feels like a prayer that needs no words. At last she says softly, "Majesty, you have come a long way." His eyes glisten, and he answers, "You showed me the way." She shakes her head gently. "No, sire, time showed us both." He lowers his head, pressing her hand to his lips. "Then let us thank time," he whispers, "for it has been merciful." They remain there, motionless, until the sun begins to set, and the light turns golden upon the floor. It is the last time they will see each other. When he rises, he hesitates at the doorway, turns once more, and meets her gaze. "You will not be forgotten," he says. She smiles faintly, her voice almost a breath. "No one is forgotten, Majesty. We simply become part of one another." In the days that follow, she grows quieter, her strength fading like the glow of twilight. The courtiers speak in hushed tones. The palace walks as though afraid to disturb her peace. She receives her children one by one, blessing them, speaking little, her touch as light as the air itself. Each departs with tears, yet none with despair. She's given them something greater than grief, acceptance. And when she is alone, she returns to her chair by the window, where she can see the sky darken into evening. The first stars appear, faint and steady, and she whispers, "So this is eternity, a night that does not end, yet does not fear the dark." Her death, when it comes, is gentle. The attendants find her at dawn, her hands folded upon her lap, her expression serene. On the table beside her rests a candle burned low, its last drop of wax hardened into the shape of a small white petal. The letter to her son lies sealed beside it. The king, upon hearing the news, closes his eyes and remains silent for a long time. When he finally speaks, it is not to his courtiers, but to himself. "She was my light," he says, "and even the setting sun leaves its glow upon the earth." The narrator's voice lowers, hushed as a prayer. The palace mourns, but without spectacle. There is no grand procession, no dramatic farewell. The world that once watched her rise and expected her to fall now witnesses something far more profound. Her quiet departure, dignified, untroubled, complete. In the chapel that evening, the king attends Mass alone. When the choir begins to sing, he does not bow his head but looks upward, as though following her soul's ascent through the vaulted air. The music swells, and in that moment even the candles seem to tremble with memory. Years later, the letter will be found among her son's papers, its ink faded but legible, its words still radiant with the calm of their author. Philosophers and poets will quote it, preachers will read from it in distant provinces. It will become known as the Testament of Light, the last gift of the woman who once embodied the glitter of an age, and who, in the end, became its conscience. The narrator allows the silence to lengthen before speaking again. "She left not monuments," he murmurs, "but sentences. And sometimes words endure longer than stone." The candle gutters, the air grows still, and the story bends toward its close. Madame de Montespan has gone, but her voice, carried through her letters and her memory, continues to whisper through the corridors of time, a voice that reminds all who listen that grace once found never dies. The years that follow her passing move like the slow ripples left by a stone cast into still water. Versailles continues, but something within it has changed forever. The king, now in the twilight of his life, walks its vast corridors like a man wandering through memory. The music has grown quieter, the laughter rare. Yet in the hush of those golden rooms there lingers a warmth that no absence can erase. The courtiers speak of Madame de Montespan only in whispers now, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as legend. Her name has taken on that sacred gentleness which time gives only to the truly redeemed, Where once she had been the flame that startled the court, she is now its afterglow, the faint yet enduring light that softens all it touches. Louis feels her presence everywhere. In the mornings, when sunlight filters through the windows of the chapel, he imagines it as her spirit visiting him. No longer the laughter of youth, but the quiet assurance of peace. At meals, he sometimes pauses mid-thought, hearing her voice in memory, patient, ironic, compassionate. To rule, she once told him, is to serve the soul as well as the body. Those words, once merely beautiful, now form the measure of his final years. The monarch who had once thought himself the sun now understands that his glory, like hers, is only borrowed light, given, not owned. He rules less through command than through presence, and the people, sensing the change, begin to speak of him not as the grand roi, but as le roi sage, the wise king. The palace itself mirrors this transformation. The endless entertainments have ceased, the banquets have grown modest, the theater no longer stages myths of conquest, but of forgiveness. The very air of Versailles, once thick with perfume and vanity, now carries the scent of wax, books, and polished wood. It has become a living monastery of reflection, not austere, but peaceful. The fountains, those eternal symbols of splendor, seem gentler now, their spray less like applause and more like prayer. Visitors from across Europe still come to marvel, but they leave subdued, aware that the age of glitter has given way to something rarer, the age of meaning. The king writes more often in these last years. His letters are filled with gratitude, addressed not to ministers or monarchs, but to the unseen, to God, to memory, to her. He writes, "I have learned that love, when purified by suffering, becomes the nearest thing to grace. I thank heaven that I was allowed to see it once, even if only in human form." He never names her, yet everyone who reads those words knows to whom they belong. The court poet, moved by his melancholy, composes verses comparing her to the setting sun, the sun that does not die, but continues in reflection upon the clouds and waters of the earth. The poem circulates quietly through Paris, copied by hand, until it becomes almost proverbial. The sun does not vanish, it changes its place in the sky. The narrator pauses here, letting the listener feel the stillness of this ending world, a silence filled not with loss, but with completion. France itself has entered a new rhythm. The scholars and dreamers who were once her protégés now shape the thought of the nation. The reforms born of her compassion and his humility have taken root, unseen but indestructible. The hospitals continue to heal, the schools continue to teach, and the poor, though still many, feel the weight of the crown lighten upon them. Even beyond the borders, other rulers begin to imitate this gentler order. Europe's cold brilliance begins to thaw, touched by the echo of their example. And yet beneath all this there is a sadness, not of failure, but of farewell. The king, now confined by age and pain, spends his evenings watching the sunset from his chamber. The light stretches across the gardens she once walked, touching the statues she had chosen, the fountains she had admired. Each evening it feels as though she returns in that radiance, walking beside him unseen. "You see," he whispers once to his valet, "the sun sets where she went." The servants say that on such evenings his face softens, the lines of pride and command smoothing into something almost childlike. He sits in silence until the last ray fades and then murmurs a prayer, half to heaven, half to her. In this imagined history, his final years pass not in guilt or loneliness, but in gentle illumination. He rules until the end with calm authority, his decrees marked by fairness and compassion. When he dies, there is no fear, no thunderous mourning. The bells of France toll softly, and the people, though grieving, do not despair. They remember that their monarch, once a figure of earthly majesty, had grown into something greater, a teacher of mortality, The narrator's voice, warm and low, describes the scene. The great chapel lit by thousands of candles, the air heavy with incense, and above the coffin of the king, a single shaft of sunlight piercing through the stained glass, falling like a benediction. "It is she," someone whispers, and others nod. Years pass, and Versailles itself changes. The mirrors tarnish, the gilding fades, yet the air still carries something of their presence. Tourists of later centuries will walk its halls and sense it, that faint vibration of tenderness woven into the marble and glass. The historians will speak of architecture, of politics, of art, but the older guides, those who have lived within its shadow, will lower their voices and say, "It was love that built this, love, and the forgiveness that follows it." And perhaps if one stands quietly enough in the Hall of Mirrors at dusk, one might still hear her laughter, not the laughter of ambition, but of release. The narrator draws the final threads together with a voice both tender and solemn. "Thus ends the age of the sun," he says, "not in the blaze of conquest, but in the hush of comprehension. The light that once blinded the world now softens its edges. What began as passion ends as prayer." He pauses, letting the silence breathe, as if to remind the listener that history, too, must bow before eternity. In another world she fell. In this one she rose, not toward power, but toward peace. And through her, the king learned that to be divine is not to rule the earth, but to forgive it. Outside the palace, evening deepens over the gardens. The fountains fall silent one by one. The last birds cross the sky like fading brushstrokes of sound. And for a moment, as the final light rests upon the gilded roof, it seems as though the sun itself bows in reverence, not to the king, nor to his mistress, but to the quiet truth their lives revealed. That love, purified of pride, is the only power that endures. And then the light fades, leaving only stillness, a stillness vast and kind, like the closing of a book whose last page glows with warmth. The narrator's final words come like a benediction. "The echo of the sun remains," he says softly, "not in the heavens, but in the hearts that remember."